The autumn of 1987 arrived in Boulder, Colorado, with a crispness that felt different that year. The aspens along the foothills had turned their brilliant gold earlier than usual, and locals whispered about an early winter. For 17-year-old Marcus Hadley, it should have been the start of his senior year at Boulder High School, a time of college applications and Friday night football games. Instead, it marked the beginning of something no one in their quiet mountain community could have predicted. Marcus lived with his mother, Diana, in a modest ranch house on the west side of town, where the streets began to slope upward toward the Flatirons. His father had left when Marcus was 7, drifting somewhere toward California and leaving behind only child support checks that arrived irregularly. Diana worked 2 jobs, mornings at the university library and evenings waitressing at Tom's Tavern on Pearl Street, to keep their small household afloat. Marcus helped however he could, taking shifts at the Safeway after school, his paycheck going toward groceries and his mother's mounting bills. He was a quiet kid, the type teachers remembered fondly, but struggled to describe in detail. Brown hair that fell across his forehead, grey eyes that seemed perpetually thoughtful, a lean frame from years of hiking the trails above town. His best friend, Kevin Ortiz, had known him since middle school, and even Kevin admitted that Marcus kept parts of himself locked away, especially after his father left. Before we continue with Marcus's story, if you're enjoying this mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Now back to that fateful autumn in Boulder. September 23rd started like any ordinary Tuesday. Marcus attended his morning classes, sat through Mr. Patterson's droning lecture on the Civil War, ate lunch with Kevin under the cottonwood tree near the football field. After school, he clocked in at Safeway, stocking shelves and helping elderly customers carry groceries to their cars. His shift ended at 7. Diana had the night off from the tavern, a rare occurrence. She'd planned to make Marcus's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and they'd watch a movie together, something they hadn't done in months. She remembered checking the kitchen clock at 7:15, expecting to hear his pickup truck rumbling into the driveway any minute. Marcus drove a 1979 Ford F-150, rust-colored and temperamental, but it ran, and that was enough. 7:30 came and went, then 8 o'clock. Diana called the Safeway and spoke with the manager, Ron, who confirmed Marcus had clocked out right on time at 7:03. He'd seemed normal, maybe a bit tired, but nothing unusual. Ron had watched him walk to his truck in the parking lot, had even waved goodbye. By 9 o'clock, Diana's concern had transformed into full panic. She called Kevin, who hadn't heard from Marcus since school let out. She called the handful of other friends Marcus occasionally mentioned, but none had seen him. At 9:45, she drove to the police station on 33rd Street, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The officer who took her report was kind but practiced, explaining that 17-year-olds sometimes took off without warning, that most showed up within 24 hours. He took down the details anyway. Marcus's description, the truck's license plate number, his last known location. Diana insisted this wasn't like her son. Marcus was responsible. He called when he'd be late. He wouldn't just vanish. The officer promised to put out a bulletin, to have patrol cars keep an eye out for the rust-colored Ford. He suggested Diana go home in case Marcus returned. She drove back through the dark streets of Boulder, the mountains looming like black shadows against the star-filled sky, and sat in her living room until dawn, the pot roast growing cold on the stove. Marcus's truck was found the next morning by a jogger on Flagstaff Road, a winding mountain route that climbed west from Boulder into the foothills. The truck sat in a small pullout about 4 miles up, where hikers often parked to access trails leading deeper into the Rockies. The doors were unlocked. The keys dangled from the ignition. Marcus's backpack lay on the passenger seat, his wallet inside containing $43 and his driver's license. His jacket was folded neatly in the truck bed. The discovery launched an immediate search. Boulder County Sheriff's deputies combed the surrounding trails, calling Marcus's name into the pine forests and rocky canyons. Volunteers from the community joined, including teachers from the high school and regular customers from Safeway, who remembered the polite teenager who always offered to help. Search and rescue teams brought dogs that picked up Marcus's scent along the Flagstaff Trail, but lost it after half a mile near a cluster of boulders where the path split in 3 directions. For 2 weeks, searchers covered every inch of accessible terrain. Helicopters swept the higher elevations. Divers checked the reservoirs and streams, though the water was already cold with approaching winter. Local television stations ran Marcus's picture, his junior year school photo, where he wore a slight, uncertain smile, on the evening news. Diana appeared at a press conference, her voice breaking as she begged anyone with information to come forward. But the mountains kept their secrets. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no body. As October turned to November and the first snows began dusting the peaks, the official search was scaled back. The sheriff's department kept the case open, but the daily efforts ceased. Marcus Hadley had simply walked into the wilderness and disappeared, as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Diana refused to accept it. She took a leave of absence from both jobs and spent her days driving Flagstaff Road, parking at different pullouts, hiking every trail she could manage. Kevin joined her on weekends, the two of them moving through the forests in silence, looking for anything, a scrap of fabric, a footprint, some sign that Marcus had been there. They found nothing. The months that followed were a special kind of torment. Diana's savings evaporated. Bills piled up. Well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles and offered prayers, but their eyes held a resignation Diana couldn't bear to acknowledge. By Christmas, even Kevin's visits had become less frequent. He was applying to colleges, moving forward with his life, and Diana understood but resented it nonetheless. The first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance came and went. Then the second. The local newspaper ran a small story, a reminder of the unsolved case, but Boulder had moved on. New tragedies, new headlines. Diana kept Marcus's room exactly as he'd left it, posters of bands on the walls, textbooks stacked on his desk, his hiking boots by the door. She returned to work, functioning on autopilot, her life divided into before and after that September night. She never stopped searching, though. On her days off, she drove into the mountains, sometimes parking at the same pullout where Marcus's truck had been found, sitting for hours and staring at the trails, as if concentration alone might reveal what had happened. Other times she drove farther, exploring side roads and forgotten paths, convinced that somewhere in these mountains an answer waited. The investigation, such as it was, produced theories but no conclusions. Some believed Marcus had gotten lost on an unfamiliar trail and succumbed to the elements, his body hidden in some remote ravine where searchers hadn't reached. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he'd been picked up by someone on Flagstaff Road, that the abandoned truck was staged, that Marcus might have met with foul play. A few suggested he'd run away deliberately, though this theory gained little traction among those who knew him. Marcus had problems, sure, but he wasn't the type to abandon his mother without a word. Kevin graduated in 1988 and enrolled at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, an hour north. He visited Diana when he came home for holidays, always asking if there'd been any news, always seeing the same hollow hope in her eyes when she shook her head. He felt guilty for moving forward, for laughing with new friends, for sometimes going entire days without thinking about Marcus. But life had that momentum, pulling him along whether he resisted or not. By 1990, Diana had developed a ritual. On the 23rd of every month, she drove to Flagstaff Road at the exact time Marcus had disappeared. parked in that same pullout, and walked the trail for exactly 1 hour. She marked the dates in a calendar she kept in her nightstand, a red X for each completed vigil. It was the only way she knew to tell Marcus she hadn't forgotten, that she was still looking, still waiting for him to come home. The case file sat in a drawer at the sheriff's office, periodically reviewed but yielding nothing new. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd taken over the investigation in 1989, read through it every few months, hoping fresh eyes might catch something previous investigators had missed. She'd interviewed Marcus's classmates again, talked to his Safeway co-workers, even tracked down his father in Sacramento, who'd seemed genuinely shocked and saddened by the news. Nothing connected. No enemies, no secret life, no reason for Marcus Hadley to vanish. 3 years became 4, then 4 became 5. In the spring of 1992, a geology graduate student from the University of Colorado named Tom Brennan was conducting fieldwork in the mountains west of Boulder, studying rock formations for his thesis. He'd ventured into an area known locally as the Batasso Preserve, a sprawling expanse of forest and canyon land crossed by narrow trails that saw far less traffic than the popular routes near town. Tom was specifically interested in sandstone formations, and he'd heard from a professor about some unusual cliff faces in a remote section of the preserve, accessible only by an unmarked path that branched off from Canyon Loop Trail. It was late April. The snow finally melted from all but the highest peaks, and Tom set out early one Saturday morning with his camera, notebook, and climbing gear. The path was barely visible, overgrown with scrub oak and mountain mahogany, clearly unused for years. Tom pushed through, following his topographic map and compass, climbing steadily upward. After 90 minutes of bushwhacking, he emerged onto a rocky outcropping that overlooked a narrow canyon. Below him, a seasonal creek rushed with snowmelt. Above, the sandstone cliff rose another 100 feet, its face weathered into strange, flowing patterns. Tom spent the morning taking photographs and measurements, noting the layers of sediment and the erosion patterns. Around noon, as he ate a sandwich while sitting on a boulder, he noticed something odd in the cliff face about 30 feet to his left. A dark gap, partially obscured by a twisted juniper that grew from a crack in the rock. It looked like the entrance to a small cave. Caves weren't uncommon in this geology, but Tom's curiosity was piqued. He packed up his lunch, secured his camera in his backpack, and carefully traversed the rock face toward the opening. The juniper's branches scraped his shoulders as he squeezed past, and suddenly he was standing in the mouth of a shallow cave, maybe 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The floor was covered in dust and small rocks. The walls were rough sandstone, untouched by graffiti or vandalism. Tom pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. The light caught something on the back wall, and he stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravelly floor. There, carved into the sandstone about chest height, were words. The cuts were crude, made with something sharp and jagged, the letters uneven but unmistakably deliberate. Marcus Hadley. Below that, September 1987. And below that, 3 more words that made Tom's blood run cold. Help me, please. Tom stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He'd lived in Boulder for 2 years, working on his degree, and even he remembered the name Marcus Hadley, the missing teenager, the case that had consumed the community 5 years ago and then faded into the background of unsolved mysteries. He backed out of the cave, his mind racing. This was evidence. This was something real. He fumbled for his map, tried to mark the exact location, then began the scramble back down to the trail. His heart pounded as he ran, his backpack bouncing against his spine, branches whipping his face. He needed to get to a phone. He needed to call the police. 2 hours later, Tom burst into the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, dusty and breathless, demanding to speak to whoever was handling the Marcus Hadley case. The desk officer looked skeptical until Tom produced his photographs, shaky but clear, showing the carved words on the cave wall. Detective Sarah Chen was at her desk when they brought Tom back. She'd been reviewing a different case, something mundane involving a string of car thefts, and when the officer explained what Tom had found, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her. She'd thought about Marcus Hadley just days ago, had driven past the memorial bench his mother had installed on the Pearl Street Mall, a small plaque with his name and dates. "Show me," Sarah said. Tom spread his photographs on her desk, explaining how he'd found the cave, describing its location. Sarah studied the images, her detective's mind already working through possibilities and implications. The carving looked authentic, weathered, not fresh. The letters were awkward, carved with desperation rather than care. If this was a hoax, it was an elaborate one, hidden in a location no casual hiker would ever stumble upon. "I need you to take us back there," Sarah said. "First thing tomorrow morning. Can you do that?" Tom nodded, and absolutely. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd committed to memory years ago. It rang 4 times before Diana Hadley answered, her voice cautious and tired. "Mrs. Hadley," Sarah said gently. "This is Detective Chen. I need you to come down to the station. We've found something." The next morning, a team assembled at the trailhead. Detective Chen, Tom Brennan, 2 deputies, a forensic technician, and a photographer from the sheriff's office. Diana had wanted to come, but Sarah had gently refused, explaining that they needed to process the scene first, to understand what they were dealing with before involving families. Diana had accepted this with a numb resignation born from 5 years of disappointments. They hiked in single file, Tom leading, following the faint path he'd marked with orange ribbons the day before. The morning air was cool, scented with pine and damp earth. Birds called from the trees. It felt impossibly peaceful, at odds with the grim purpose of their expedition. When they reached the cave, Sarah went in first, her flashlight illuminating the carved words. She stood there for a long moment, reading them again and again, feeling the weight of what they might mean. Marcus Hadley had been here. He'd carved his name, the date, a plea for help. And then what? Had he walked back out and gotten lost? Had he fallen somewhere nearby? Or had something else happened, something that left him unable to leave this remote canyon? The forensic team went to work, photographing every angle, taking samples of the sandstone dust around the carving, looking for any other evidence, fabric fibers, hair, blood. They found nothing else, just the words, stark and desperate, carved into stone. "We need to search this entire area," Sarah said. "Every canyon, every ravine. Bring in the dogs again, bring in everyone." The search resumed that afternoon, 5 years after Marcus Hadley had disappeared. Volunteers who'd given up hope rallied once more. Kevin Ortiz drove down from Fort Collins as soon as he heard, joining the teams that spread out from the cave in all directions. Diana waited at home, unable to eat or sleep, her phone clutched in her hand. For 3 days they searched. The terrain was brutal. Steep slopes, dense undergrowth, rocky crevices that could hide anything. The dogs caught scents but lost them in the complex topography. Search and rescue teams rappelled into narrow gorges, waded through the swollen creek, climbed to ledges that seemed impossible to reach. On the 3rd day, late in the afternoon, 2 deputies searching a ravine about a quarter-mile east of the cave found something wedged between 2 boulders, hidden from above by an overhang, bleached by sun and scattered by animals, but unmistakable. Human remains. The identification process took 2 weeks. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains belonged to Marcus Hadley. The coroner determined that Marcus had died from injuries consistent with a fall, multiple fractures, blunt force trauma. The location suggested he'd been climbing or scrambling on the rocks above the ravine and had slipped, falling approximately 40 feet onto the boulders below. Based on the deterioration and the position of the remains, the coroner estimated death had occurred in late September or early October 1987, within days or weeks of his disappearance. Detective Chen pieced together what she believed had happened. Marcus had driven up Flagstaff Road that night, perhaps needing to think, to escape for a while. He'd parked at the pullout and started hiking, maybe following a trail, maybe just wandering. He'd somehow found his way to that remote canyon, explored the cave, carved his name, perhaps sensing he was in trouble, perhaps already injured from a previous fall, leaving a message in case he didn't make it out. Then he'd continued moving, disoriented or hurt, and had fallen into the ravine where his body was eventually discovered. But questions remained. Why had he gone so far off any established trail? The cave was in an area that even experienced hikers rarely visited, reachable only by bushwhacking through difficult terrain. Had Marcus been lost, desperately trying to find his way back to civilization? Or had he been running from something, though no evidence suggested foul play? And why had he carved those words? Had he been injured already when he entered the cave, aware that he might not survive, leaving a final message to tell the world he'd been there? Diana Hadley finally got her answer, though it brought no peace. Marcus hadn't run away. He hadn't been abducted. He'd gone into the mountains seeking something, solitude, clarity, escape, and the mountains had taken him, as they'd taken others before and would take others after. She organized a funeral 5 years late, buried her son in Green Mountain Cemetery with a headstone that bore the dates 1970-1987 and the simple epitaph, "Lost but not forgotten." Kevin Ortiz gave a eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about his friend, about the quiet kid who'd loved hiking and had dreams of studying forestry, who'd never gotten the chance to become whoever he might have been. Diana sat in the front row, surrounded by people who'd searched for Marcus, who'd kept his memory alive through 5 years of uncertainty. She wept not just for the son she'd lost, but for the 5 years she'd spent in limbo, not knowing, unable to grieve properly. The case was officially closed. The newspapers ran the story, missing teen found after 5 years. And for a few days, Boulder remembered Marcus Hadley again. But eventually, inevitably, the town moved on once more. Diana kept one thing from the cave. Detective Chen had arranged for a small section of the sandstone to be carefully removed, preserving Marcus's carving. It sat now on Diana's mantelpiece, those desperate words a permanent reminder of her son's final hours. She would run her fingers over the rough letters sometimes, imagining Marcus in that cave, alone and afraid, using his last strength to leave a mark that said he'd existed, that he'd been there, that he'd needed help. Years later, the Batasso Preserve placed a small marker near the trail that branched off toward the canyon where Marcus had died. It didn't give details, just acknowledged that a young man had lost his life in these mountains. A reminder to hikers to stay on marked trails, to tell someone where they were going, to respect the wilderness that could be beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Tom Brennan finished his geology thesis and moved away from Colorado, but he never forgot that spring day when he'd climbed to a remote cliff face and found words carved in stone, a message from someone long gone. He thought about it whenever he went hiking, how we leave traces of ourselves in unexpected places, how the earth holds secrets until someone stumbles upon them by chance or fate. Kevin Ortiz graduated from Colorado State and became a teacher, eventually returning to Boulder to teach at the same high school he and Marcus had attended. When students asked about the memorial bench on Pearl Street, he would tell them about his friend, about the importance of the outdoors, but also its dangers, about how someone you love can disappear in an instant, and how you carry that absence forever. Diana lived another 20 years, working at the library until she retired, finding small joys where she could. She never remarried, never had other children. Marcus had been her world, and when he disappeared, part of her had gone with him into those mountains. Even after finding him, after the funeral, after the official closure, she felt his absence every day. She continued her monthly vigils, though they changed form. Instead of driving to Flagstaff Road, she hiked to the memorial marker near Batasso Preserve, sitting on a flat rock overlooking the canyon where her son had died. She brought flowers sometimes, or just sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the pines, the same wind that had blown through these mountains the night Marcus disappeared. On what would have been Marcus's 40th birthday in 2010, Diana made the hike one last time. She was 68 now, her knees aching on the steep sections, her breath coming hard in the thin mountain air. But she made it to the marker, sat on her usual rock, and looked out over the wilderness that had taken her son. She thought about all the things Marcus would never experience: college, a career, love, maybe children of his own. She thought about the grandchildren she would never have, the life that had been cut short by a moment of misjudgment or bad luck on a darkening September evening 23 years ago. The unfairness of it still burned, though the rage had mellowed into a deep, permanent sadness. But she also thought about the 5 years of not knowing, of living in that terrible limbo between hope and despair. As painful as the truth had been, it was still better than the uncertainty. She'd been able to bury her son, to say goodbye, to move forward in whatever limited way she could manage. That was something. It had to be something. Detective Sarah Chen retired from the Boulder County Sheriff's Office in 2015 after 30 years of service. The Marcus Hadley case remained one of the most memorable of her career, not because of its complexity — it was, in the end, a tragic accident — but because of what it taught her about persistence and chance. If Tom Brennan hadn't been studying that particular rock formation, if he hadn't noticed that gap in the cliff face, if he hadn't squeezed past that juniper tree, Marcus might never have been found. Diana Hadley might have died without ever knowing what happened to her son. Sarah kept a photograph on her desk throughout her career, a copy of one of Tom's pictures showing the carved words in the cave. It reminded her that answers existed, even when they seemed impossible to find, even when years had passed and hope had faded. Sometimes all it took was one person looking in the right place at the right time. The cave itself became something of a pilgrimage site for a while after the story broke in 1992. Hikers who knew about Marcus's disappearance would bushwhack off-trail to find it, to see the carving with their own eyes. Some left tributes, flowers that wilted in the dry air, coins, handwritten notes. The Forest Service eventually placed signs discouraging off-trail hiking in that area, both for safety and to preserve the site, but people still went. Over the years, weather and erosion began to wear away the carving. The sharp edges of the letters softened, filled with dust and lichen. By 2020, the words were barely legible, visible only if you knew what you were looking for and held the light at the right angle. In a way, it seemed fitting, Marcus's desperate message slowly returning to the stone, becoming part of the mountain that had claimed him. Kevin Ortiz brought his own students to the memorial marker sometimes, as part of lessons about outdoor safety and the fragility of life. He would tell them about Marcus, not dwelling on the tragedy, but celebrating who his friend had been. The quiet kid who loved these mountains, who'd worked hard to help his mom, who'd had his whole life ahead of him. Kevin always emphasized that Marcus hadn't been reckless or stupid. He'd simply made a decision that millions of people make every day, to go for a hike, and circumstances had conspired against him. "The mountains don't care about your plans," Kevin would tell his students, they don't care if you're a good person or if people are waiting for you at home. You have to respect them, understand the risks, and never go alone without telling someone where you'll be. Some of his students rolled their eyes, thinking he was being overdramatic, but others listened, understanding that Mr. Ortiz was speaking from a place of personal loss, that the lesson had cost him something dear. Diana Hadley passed away in her sleep in January 2012 at the age of 70. Her obituary in the Daily Camera mentioned her decades of service at the university library, her love of gardening, and her son Marcus, who had preceded her in death. At her request, she was buried next to him in Green Mountain Cemetery, their matching headstones side by side, mother and son reunited at last. Kevin organized the funeral, attended by former co-workers, neighbors, and people who remembered the search for Marcus all those years ago. Detective Chen came, now retired but still carrying the weight of that case. Tom Brennan, who'd moved back to Colorado and was teaching at the university, drove down from Fort Collins. They stood together in the winter cold, watching as Diana was laid to rest, and each of them thought about the different ways Marcus's disappearance had touched their lives. The story of Marcus Hadley became one of Boulder's enduring mysteries, even after it was solved. Local historians included it in books about the area's history. Podcasters and bloggers discussed it as a cautionary tale about wilderness safety. The memorial bench on Pearl Street remained, a quiet tribute to a teenager who'd vanished and been found, who'd left his mark quite literally on the landscape. Years passed. The people who'd known Marcus personally grew older, retired, moved away, died. New generations moved to Boulder, drawn by the university, the tech industry, the outdoor lifestyle. They hiked the same trails Marcus had hiked, drove the same winding mountain roads, looked out at the same flatirons rising above the city. Most had never heard his name, but in a cave slowly eroding back to smooth stone, and on a memorial marker weathering in the mountain air, and in the memories of a handful of people who'd loved him or searched for him or found him, Marcus Hadley remained, a reminder that every missing person has a story, that every search matters, and that sometimes the mountains give back what they've taken, even if it takes 5 years and a chance discovery to make it happen. The last words carved in that cave, "Help me please," had been a plea that went unanswered for 5 years. But in the end, help had come, not for Marcus, but for those he'd left behind. Tom Brennan's discovery had given Diana closure, had let her bury her son, had transformed her agonizing uncertainty into painful but manageable grief. That was Marcus's final gift to his mother. Those words scratched desperately into sandstone, a message in a bottle cast from the depths of fear and injury, eventually found and brought home. In the vast indifference of the wilderness, in the face of tragedy and loss, that small act of leaving evidence, of marking his presence, had mattered more than he could have known in those final moments. The mountains of Colorado continue to draw people seeking beauty, adventure, solitude, and challenge. And occasionally, inevitably, they claim someone. A hiker who misjudges a trail, a climber who makes one wrong move, a person seeking escape who wanders too far and can't find their way back. Search teams go out, families wait and hope, communities rally and search. Sometimes they find answers quickly, sometimes it takes years, and sometimes the mountains keep their secrets forever. Marcus Hadley was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. He was found. His mother got to say goodbye. His story had an ending, however tragic. In that there was a kind of peace.